It's horrible. Everything's horrible. Okay, welcome everybody. Good evening. It's fantastic to be here. This is the first time we're doing a hybrid development lecture, so we're hoping it's all going to work really well. So welcome to everyone online. So first of all, I'm Professor Rachel Sabates-Wheeler. I work here at the Institute of Development Studies. I've been here for quite a long time. And this is the third lecture in our Sussex Development Lecture Series for this season, this term. And just so you all know, this lecture series is an opportunity to hear from some leading global thinkers we have here, and particularly on areas that are really quite topical in development. And it is jointly run by IDS, by the School of Global Studies, by SPRU, that's the Science Policy and Research Unit, and the Centre for International Education at the University of Sussex. And just to remind you, this series this year is on, the topic is called Development in an Uncertain World. So I don't know if you've been to any of the previous ones, this is the third one. And pretty much we're saying that we're asking, how do we conceptualize uncertainty and its relationship with sustainable and inclusive development processes? So they're the big questions framing the whole series. And what are the implications for research and for action? So that's what we're doing. In terms of just a few nuts and bolts, we're going to have a 45-minute presentation approximately. I'll introduce you to the presenters in a minute. And then we'll have 30 minutes of Q&A, and there might be a bit of buzz groups going on, but we'll see how it goes. And because it's a hybrid lecture in terms of online and here, when should you want to ask a question, and I hope there's going to be lots of questions, we're going to ask you to come up to the mic here to ask the question so that everyone can see you and hear you properly. And for those of you online, Gary, who is standing over on the side, will be reading out your questions. So please feel free to post questions online as we go through. So I hope that's clear. So fantastic. Today, I am delighted to present Mairead Dunn and Sarah Humphreys. You'll see her online up here. I've had the pleasure of working with them a little bit. A year and a half ago, actually, the research they're presenting today comes out of a big program of work that was ongoing on children's work in African agriculture. So Mairead is a professor of sociology of education, and she's the former director of the CIE, Centre for International Education at Sussex University. And her research has focused in the last years on the linkages between educational and social inequalities. And in particular, she focuses on gender and sexuality and identities and difference. So her publications, she's got many publications, but a couple just to highlight: Gender, Sexuality and Development, Education and Society in Sub-Saharan Africa, that's a book she's published, and another book is on education, conflict and reconciliation. Welcome. And Dr. Sarah Humphreys, who's an associate of education faculty here at University of Sussex. She has lived and worked in a number of countries, and she's engaged in multiple collaborative research, evaluation and consultancy projects on education and concerning many different issues in countries of the global south. So some key areas of focus that she does research on is on gender and equity in education, school access, quality, community participation, and teacher education. And she's particularly interested in looking at these issues in Sub-Saharan Africa. So today they're going to be presenting. The title of the presentation is Disrupting Conceptual Certainties, Reconsidering Children's Work and Schooling. And so they are particularly interested in reconsidering the dominant conceptual frameworks that surround children's work and schooling. And so they're going to draw on research they've done in Sub-Saharan Africa, particularly Ghana, and they're going to challenge some universal assumptions about what constitutes work and childhood. So it should be really interesting. So over to you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Rachel. Thanks for that generous introduction. We're going to go with the PowerPoint. Yeah, thank you. We're doing a double act here. Well, we're doing a triple act, actually. There's myself and Sarah and Gary, who's helping us with the PowerPoint. Thanks. We start with this quote from an Enlightenment writer. Even in this post-colonial, postmodern world, uncertainty is not a comfortable position, but certainty is an absurd one. So let's look at the title of what we're doing, as Rachel has said, Disrupting Conceptual Certainties, Reconsidering Children's Work and Schooling. And this presentation comes from work, as Rachel has said, from work on children's harmful work in African agriculture, and it comes from from this work. We produced this working paper, and that project that allowed us to get that far into the work was led by Rachel and Jim Sundberg, who was here at IDS. And it was also supported by Carolina Zip, who helped us work with some of the literature related to this study. Okay, so, sorry. The point of this presentation really is to destabilize certainties, as you might guess by the title. But the key questions that we are going to engage with are questions about the assumptions about the relationship between education and work. And in particular, we're going to look at the idea of work, we're going to look at the idea of childhoods and the ideas of education.
We need some, sorry, can you hear me? No? We need something on the...
Oh, sorry.
There. Somebody needs to, yeah, thank you.
Thank you, it's me, I need to.
Oh, right, you need
It's just that I can't see the screen. So anyway, we'll continue.
Okay.
Interesting, so yeah, thank you, Sarah. And the idea is that we're going to interrogate some of the dominant research paradigms that help to construct truths about children, work and schooling. We're also going to offer an alternative conceptualization of those relationships. And in particular, we're going to unlock the black box of schooling with regard to the dominant child labour discourse. Okay, at this point, I'm going to hand over to Sarah and you'll be back to me shortly. Over to you, Sarah.
Okay, can you all hear me? Just checking again. Yes?
Yes.
Okay, fine. I'm very sorry I can't see you. I hope there's millions in there and you're all on the edge of your seat. I'm actually zooming in from the Caribbean, so I'm not only a long way away, but I'm also a different time of the day. So good evening to you and good afternoon to anyone who's listening from this part of the world. First of all, I thought we should just look at these child labour stats before we start to unpick what is child labour and what does any of this mean. These are from the latest ILO and UNICEF estimates and global trends from 2021. 160 million children supposedly in child labour, whatever that might mean, and we'll look at that more later. Over half are in Sub-Saharan Africa. 87 million in what's called child labour, 39 million in hazardous work, which is a subset of child labour. 24% aged between 5 and 17 are said to be in child labour. 82% are in rural areas. 82% of these are in agriculture, and 82% are working for the family and the household, as opposed to working in commercial enterprises. So you can check all of those out. So that's the kind of global picture that is being painted to us within the dominant discourse of ILO's Sustainable Development Goals and all the other UN agencies, FAO, etc. Right. So next one, please. So for those people who are not very familiar with the child labour and the anti-child labour rather movement, and the SDGs with regards to decent work and child labour and education. We'll just go through a few definitions, which of course we're then going to interrogate later. So first one is child labour itself. That is, I've taken these from the website. Obviously, there are in greater detail on the conventions for child labour and the various, human rights conventions. But this is what's taken from their website: work that is mentally, physically, socially, or morally dangerous and harmful to children and or interferes with their schooling. So the interfering with schooling is important, because no matter what else it's doing, if it interferes with schooling, it's child labour. Within this, there's a subset, worst forms of child labour, WFCL, which includes slavery, trafficking, prostitution, pornography, illicit activities generally assumed to be drug running, and hazardous child labour, which is the next one. Yeah, here we are, which is work by its nature or the circumstances in which it's carried out is likely to harm the health, safety, or morals of children. All to be up for grabs. And of course, these terms actually depend on the child's numerical age, the type, and the hours of work. So for these surveys, we've got, for example, I can give you one example, the latest UNICEF and ILO for age 5 to 11 years, any hour of economic activity per week, or at least 21 hours of household chores, constitutes child labour. So these terms and ages differ, and also they differ depending on countries. Different countries have their own lists of what they consider to be hazardous work, and they also have different age groups to which they decide it is permissible or not to work certain hours. And the work that is permissible is often termed light work and not to be considered child labour. So that comes from the UNICEF briefing note on number 13 on SDG, and the other comes from the ILO website. So we need to sort of bear these definitions in mind as we go along and start to unpick them. However, before we get into that, we're going to have a quiz. So all of you, please, online and in the room, if you could have a pen and paper, jot down 1 to 6. 1 to 6 on a piece of paper. Scrap paper will do. You can talk to your neighbour about your answers afterwards, or you can just consider yourself what your answer is, and then we'll go back over the answers. So write down 1 to 6 and we'll go through the pictures, and you've got to decide, is this education or is this child labour? Gut reaction. Are we all ready? Pens to the ready? Paper to the ready? I can't see, so are we there, Mairead? Is everybody?
Yeah, number 1, they're all ready. They're looking very ready.
Number 1, picture, is this education or is this child labour? Picture 2. Oh, yeah. Oh, somebody's already answered online. Just write it. Yeah, write it down. Hold that thought with you, and then we'll go through what people think at the end. Picture 2, education or child labour?
She's blurred them out.
Picture 3. Yes, I have anonymised the faces for the ethics of this presentation. Picture 3, education or child labour? Picture 4, same question, education or child labour? Picture 5, same question, education or child labour? And the last one, picture 6. Right, if you happen to be near somebody and are allowed to talk, you might like to confer with your neighbour. If you're online, you'll have to confer with yourself, and just take a moment to go through and talk through the answers. Just a couple of minutes, nothing more, and then we'll go back to picture 1 and go through them one at a time.
Yeah, some of them are neither, or both. Sarah?
Right, okay, yeah, yes, right.
Okay.
Daughter's been writing things in the chat, and of course she's actually anticipating where we're going with all of this anyway. So we are being a bit provocative, and we're, you know, looking where the starting point as ILO discourse, and then exactly, daughter, you're so right with all this. But anyway, your gut feeling, picture one, education, put your hands up, or indicate on your chat if you're allowed to put your hands up virtually if you think it's education.
Lots of people think it's education, Sarah.
All right. Okay, or child labour?
Nobody thinks it's child labour.
Right, of course. Now, as daughter has already said in, it could be many things, you know, depends how we define these things. We don't see a teacher. So, you know, if a teacher doesn't turn up to the classroom to teach here, does that make it education? I don't know. Somebody else has said in it's child labour. All of these questions, there's no right answer. I mean, I'm being provocative. We put the binary up because this is what the binary that is set up in the dominant discourse. But there are many questions to be asked about what exactly is going on here. So education or child labour here. Any hands up for education?
2.
Oof. Hands up for child
3.
labour? Child labour?
More for child labour.
Right, okay. Right, well, interestingly, this picture, the last one was taken in Ethiopia, this was taken in Nigeria, but these girls are actually in school and they bring their wares in school, they're in class, and at break, they take them out and they sell their sweets and things at break with the school's permission, and then they go back into class. So, you know, there are lots of, you know, they could be both. Picture 3, well, education, anybody in favour of education?
Lots think it's education.
I'll be interested to know, yeah. Lots of people do. And child labour?
It's a bit for child labour too. Some people are raising hands for both.
Yeah, well, there you go.
They've got 2 hands.
Exactly. I mean, this is partly the point of this. You know, it's not clear cut. They're in school uniform. They are working in the field here. But this is not actually an agriculture lesson. They are not learning about agriculture. This is timetabled. You work on the school farm. So one might question, you know, the education value of that. They do not get any of the benefits of the crops to take home and share with the family. This is just work for the school. So question 4, education.
Few for education.
Child labour?
More for child labour.
Right, okay. Well, of course, the context is all. Here we have a water pump. It's actually inside the school grounds. It's in school hours. The boy in pink is in school uniform. The other children are not at school, but they're getting water because the school allows people from the community to come in and get access to water. Whether you would count this education or that or any of the other terms that we're going to look at, you know, depends very much on the context. There are 2 children there clearly who are of school-going age and are not attending school because they're not in uniform. The boy of pink is in school in a uniform, but he's not in a classroom. So, you know, questions are raised again. Picture 5. What did we think of that? Education? Anybody for education?
Yep, lots for education.
Yeah. And child labour?
Nobody for child labour.
Nobody for child labour, right. Well, this is education. This is a teacher. He's got his stick in his hand, and this is the classroom because there isn't one. It's under the tree. And this is a lesson, certainly, that is happening. Whether it's education, of course, is another question. And number 6, and education, anybody?
Yeah, lots for education.
And child labour?
Couple for child labour.
Looks like detention, somebody's written in. It's very true. They're not very happy. There are a few more children. What you can't see at the bottom of this picture is, in fact, there's a massive hole in the classroom floor, which is dangerous. And if we're looking at hazardous labour, you may see on the right-hand side a rusty nail that is in there. And in this school, as we're back in Nigeria again, several of the kids complained that they felt it was very uncomfortable and very painful when they had to sit for long periods of time on the floor or on these planks because there's no furniture to be had. So lots of people, there's masses in the chat, and I haven't got time to look now, but I imagine everybody's raising the kind of questions that you should be raising. it's not just an either or, education or schooling, and not just labour. We can use the word child work, it's socialisation, it's sometimes punishment, sometimes both or neither. You know, these are the questions that we're going to raise in this talk, I hope anyway. So that was just to get everybody interested and realising that this binary that's there in the ILO literature doesn't really help us and doesn't advance us anywhere. So I'm now, I think, am I going back to you, Mairead? No, I'm not.
No.
We're just going to go back to the verbal.
Sorry.
Thank you. So in the ILO literature and in the UN literature and the SDGs, there is this false kind of dichotomy that's set up as education means schooling, and it's set up as a solution to child labour. Equally, child labour, however it might be determined, or child work, is it gets in the way of schooling. So this is from the ILO 2017 regional brief for Africa, saying basically get children out of work and into the classroom and keep them there no matter what. Similarly, FAO in their framework for ending child labour in agriculture paints a picture of very harsh conditions and equally benevolent conditions for education, meaning schooling. And as we saw from some of those pictures, it's not that simply. So we have set up in the dominant literature, we've got an oppositional and asymmetrical binary, which for people under 18 who are called children in the literature, whether they are in their own minds or not, that education, school being education, is where people should be, and work, whatever sort of form is of work that is stopping them from being in school, whatever the value of the schooling, is privilege, is not as important as the education. So we've got two visual things here, also from the FAO, where they've got this very simple vicious cycle, which means poverty leads to child labour, leads to poor participation in education, and onwards, lower earnings, etc. And then the opposite, it's virtuous cycle, where less child labour equally leads to higher school participation. And this very simple cycles we're going to unpick now and say, obviously, that it's not quite that simple at all. Is it you now?
It is me. So the question becomes then, what counts as work? And if we look at the ILO and the UN definitional categories, what every category does is it makes some things visible and other things invisible. So, you know, there's a tendency within this to think about paid and unpaid labour, formal and informal labour. And those categories are used predominantly. And what they do is they actually count out household labour. They're not really looking at household labour. Although...
Slide.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, thank you. That's what she was saying to me. It's difficult to do this. It is true, however, that in the latest trends on child labour, there has been an attempt to include household chores. However, this inclusion is not in the UN system of accounts. And it's interesting that they even would call it chores, because the word chores kind of softens something that's called labour or that's called work. Is much softer. And what we know about household labour, household work, is that it's a key site for labour, particularly for girls and women. And although household configurations of work change over time, because you get different kinds of households, you get different kinds of family forms or extended family forms, and you also get variations with age, you get variations over time, and you get variations related to, hierarchical gender norms. I think that it's that the attempt to include household labour actually has included a kind of algorithm that's tried to equate an amount of household labour with paid labour, and Sarah can elaborate on that for you later. But there's an attempt to make some kind of algorithm. However, what we do know about children as they grow is that their gender position has a massive impact on what is regarded as appropriate work for them. And with girls in particular, the view of marriage and childbearing particularly shapes the kinds of works that's regarded as appropriate for them. And similarly for boys, their futures as breadwinners also shapes the kind of work they may be required or asked to do. I mean, and one might say, if one was thinking about harm in particular, to have this strong gender binary in itself produces harm. It produces harm as you struggle with what is regarded as appropriate or not for you. So that brings us to the question of whether work prevents children from being in school. I suppose the first point is that, anything that prevents children being in school is regarded as a harm, because we've got that equation. So if they're working and they're prevented from going to school, it is already a harm. But in order to find out of these things, there are often surveys that are done that give us binaries like in and out of school or in and out of work. And what we know is that such surveys are kind of spot views of what's going on, and they don't really tell us, a nuanced enough story to find out what is actually happening. Besides, there is the fact that if children are in work or not in school, there may be multiple reasons, and the reasons for not being in school might not be just work. There may be all kinds of things happening to the household, happening in the context, and there may be, these are from political to environmental disasters to local events in the context. And it is also true that depends on the kinds of work that's available. If what work is available for children to do makes a difference to whether they attend school or not. And of course, this also depends on the ways that schools relate to their context. There are ways in which schools and their timetables are primary. Whether or not it fits in with the rhythms of lives of particular communities is kind of a secondary character or characteristic of secondary importance. So the fact that children are not in school or might be working is a kind of contextually contingent issue. And of course, it's not a contextually contingent issue that we can make a rule about, because the context makes all the difference. It changes what's important at a particular time for a particular person, for a particular family, for a particular community. So let's move then to, of course, I should add, like all of them, that everything has got its gender dynamic. These things are always dynamic and they're always gendered. So the question now becomes, is work a harm? So I guess the first thing is, as I said before, if children are out of school, doing work is regarded as a harm. However, doing work might be necessary. It might be necessary for the household reproduction, for the survival of the household. It might also be there to serve individual needs, and it might also be there actually to generate funds to pay for schooling. So there are lots of issues that complicate that relationship between schooling and work. And indeed, as elsewhere in the world, there is a kind of intergenerational contract about who does what kind of work. Particularly in poor rural households, there's usually a requirement for work to be part of the daily life of children. And that contract about what kind of work you do and when you do work is under constant negotiation. And again, going back to that difference between what is schooling and what is education, it can also be said that when working, learning is also happening. So work may allow you to have skills acquisition and make you be an apprentice in some kind of way. And indeed, the work itself might produce better opportunities than the promises that are offered by school for bright futures. Working might offer a better way forward. And I think finally we have to think about the gender distribution of work. It is usually the case that there are more opportunities for boys to do work than there are for girls. And often in contexts of need, some of the available work for girls is around transactional sex. So there is, you know, lots of ways in which that kind of work is an obvious danger. Okay, so we've thought through a little bit about work, and now we're going to have a look at the idea of childhood. That's work, this is childhood. Sarah's going to go on to education in a moment. So there are assumptions about the importance of numerical age in looking at childhoods. And age informs lots of the statistics and definitions of ILO around child labour, what's hazardous labour, what's hazardous work. These are defined by age. However, it is also the case that many children in Sub-Saharan Africa, at least, may not actually know their age. And there is a big push by some concerns to get registration going so people know their age a little bit more. On top of that, there is a kind of universalised idea that up to the age of 18, you are a child. It's only post 18 that you become an adult. And in some senses, there is an assumption or a suggestion that this all happens within a nuclear family. Decisions made about working and schooling happen in that context. And if we're to look at some of the models of childhood, they are definitely informed by Western ideas that childhood is a time for play and for schooling, whereas adulthood is a time when you work, get married, have children, and all that kind of stuff. So that dominant notion of what childhood is permeates the literature and the data gathering around childhood work and schooling. And again, returning to the idea that the culture makes a difference, that cultural context makes a difference. We do have to think about the way that it's not only age that works in terms of what you do in a household, it can also be seniority. So it's not that you've reached the age of 12, it might be that you are the eldest person of that particular, in that particular grouping to do something. So you become responsible. And as with everything else, there is a clear gender gradient to what is regarded as childhood. And interestingly enough, as people talk about childhoods, they don't really highlight. Childhood tends to be a kind of gender neutral term. Okay, handing back to you, Sarah, to take on education.
Right, okay. Just to warn you that a rain shower just passed by and I could hardly hear a word. So if I don't know what's going on in the next 5 minutes because the rain starts again, well, you'll just have to wing it, or I'll have to wing it. Okay, so we're on to education now. I think we've already got the idea that in the dominant literature of the UN and the ILO, education equals schooling. And of course, in Sub-Saharan Africa, as in many other parts of the world, it is imbued with histories of colonialism and colonial power, and we tend to be focusing on westernized curricula. And in fact, state schooling in Sub-Saharan Africa is frequently referred to as Western education as opposed to other kinds of education. So within that, there is another assumption that schooling equals learning. And as we saw from some of the photos, this isn't actually necessarily the case. And I just want to, honestly, it's a short diversion, Mairead, panic not. This comes back to the terms in school and out of school, which needs to be glossed at some stage, so we'll do it here. In the household surveys and in SDGs and things, in school either refers to school enrollment, which means You have been to a school one day in a year and put your name down if they're coming from EMIS and coming from the school data, the sorts of data that you get from UNESCO figures. And if you get them from household survey, they tend to talk about attendance data. But the questions that are asked is usually, has the person been to school in the last year? So they only need to again turn up to school in the last year or be enrolled at school on one day for a person to count as in school for any of these surveys. And as the picture showed earlier, and I'm sure many of you know and have the experience, being in school doesn't necessarily mean you're in a classroom, and in a classroom doesn't necessarily mean that you're learning or learning anything useful. So all of these assumptions there, and they need to be borne in mind when we're looking at these figures. The dominant discourse for schooling and the rationale for schooling is, of course, human capital theory and rates of return. You're supposed to invest in education so that they get the gains with the skills, the credentials, and formal employment afterwards that helps to drag people out of poverty. So the idea is schooling leads to a reduction in poverty, which is obviously an argument that has been critiqued many times by many people. Then we've also got the assumption that schooling is a benign space. It's a nice space, and particularly in the anti-child labour literature, we need to think, no, we need to take these kids out of work and put them in school because school is safe and they learn and they can play and be happy. And again, as some of those photographs showed us, and a lot of the research in schools shows us, this is not necessarily the case, which we'll look at again later. So work is therefore an obstacle to schooling and learning. And at the same time as saying education equals schooling equals learning, we're saying that learning elsewhere, whether it's in the household or the workplace, has no value, or is certainly not as important at school, which is why we have to shove all these kids in school. So on to the next slide. Right, in the ILO SDG literature, it assumes that studying does not count as work for a start. Mental work does not count studying. And as we can see, also there's a denial that harmful or hazardous work occurs in school. Now, obviously we are already questioning these very terms, harmful, hazardous work, but that's why they're in scare marks. But there's a denial that any kind of labouring or hard work goes on in school other than in lesson time, such as agriculture, where they do school farms, school gardens. People are learning about agriculture and then taking the benefit home. So certain things that go on, the types of labouring or the types of work that goes on in school, is that in rural areas, school cleaning and or time on the school farm is timetables. Now, if we think that many of these schools are on double shifts because there isn't enough infrastructure for, there's not enough schools, so we have to do double shift schooling, you're only talking about, lessons between 6:30 in the morning, maybe 12 o'clock. So you've only got a very short time. And yet there is school cleaning every morning, usually to do the classroom, and usually once a week, either to work on the farm or to do school cleaning around the compound and the toilets and that sort of thing. So there's a lot of cleaning and what might be called labour, if you want to take that word, or certainly work that goes on in schools. And labour in the sense of physical work also includes collecting water and sand for school construction. This is particularly true in rural areas, in poor communities, where they are not getting government money a lot of the time. And so there's a great reliance through decentralisation and greater community participation in that, parents even in small poor communities are being asked to chip in, either with the labour and the money, to build classrooms, repair classrooms, and collect firewood for school meals. And I think with the school meals, it's worth pointing out that this is a very widespread activity now by governments in Sub-Saharan Africa to provide kids with food to encourage them to attend school. But in certain cases, it actually gives them more work because they have to produce the firewood. And if there aren't many plates, they have to wash the plates in order to get, and that takes time away from learning as well. Learners also work as unpaid workers for teachers, sometimes with the formal blessing of the school. If they haven't received paid for the teacher, they say, well, you can have these kids clean your house. And obviously this puts young children at risk. And there is evidence in a number of studies, particularly about young girls being at risk cleaning male teachers' accommodation. As we saw earlier in one of the slides, exploitative labour on the school farm. And in fact, some of the studies in Ghana, in the working paper we referred to, talk about, parents understandably and the children in school refusing to turn up and refusing to labour for the school because, why could we be doing it for our own family? Why are we being dragged out of the fields from the family farm and the family plot to be thrown into school, not to get the benefits of any learning, but to be exploited on the school farm? Labouring is also given as punishment. And, the irony here is that the kids most likely to be punished are those that arrive late from household domestic work or from doing other commercial or work on the family farm. So they're, instead of when they are eventually arrive at school being allowed into the classroom, they are often given labour as punishment. And I'll just bring one of the most salient examples here. When we did some work in northern Nigeria, one kid, a young boy, had been out for months, many months. He'd missed school because he'd been with the family and the household, moving with the livestock. And he came back to school after many months' absence. And the first thing they did to him when he got back to school is they made him put on an overall with a big X on the back so that it was known, to humiliate him basically. So everybody knew he'd been a bad guy and he'd missed school. And then they put him to work on the school farm. So here's somebody who'd made a big effort to get into school, and then the first thing they do is say, well, you're not going in the classroom because you've missed lessons. And they punished him to go and work on the farm. So, there's plenty. This is one incident, but there are many, many examples of this. And what was the last one? Sorry, Mairead, I know you want to hurry me on. Oh, yes. And of course, the labouring as punishment, or the labouring, whether it's part of the school timetable, is always gendered. So more often than not, girls are doing the inside of the classroom, the sweeping, cleaning the toilets, and the older boys are doing the digging of latrines or weeding in the compound. And one last point in that is that in a lot of these rural schools, this is seriously last point, is that the water is often missing in these rural schools. So this is a serious health issue and a harm issue, harming their health. So you are asking people in some of these rural areas where people keep their animals at night in the school classrooms where they're not fenced. And we have been to one or two places where they've had parties and people have overnighted there and defecated in the classrooms. So sometimes these kids are cleaning defecation from the classroom and then have no water to wipe their hands or anything. So, these are the sorts of things that often go on in very remote rural schools that is never mentioned in the child labour literature, but you can find plenty in educational studies, such as the ones we cite in our paper. So I am moving on. And this is obviously a school quality issue. And ILO literature has in recent years acknowledged, it doesn't acknowledge there's child labour in school, absolutely not, or even child work to that degree in school. Work and school do not go together. But school quality is recognised as an obstacle to attending school and learning. But nevertheless, it is underemphasised. And why they say, well, we must improve the quality of schooling, kids are still being forced to go to school, even when there's no value there. Next, please. So the only quality issues that are recognised, this comes from the recent trends, and it's similar list in the FAO literature, is infrastructure, shortage of trained teachers, relevant curricula, overcrowding, and there is reference to violence, if you like, and sexual violence tends to be specified. But really schools, which we haven't got time to go into here, again, there's much literature on it, is actually full of many micro-violences, such as the language of teaching and learning. A lot of kids are being forced to learn, and teachers teach in a language they're not very proficient in, particularly in rural areas, and then they take exams in language they don't understand. At the same time, Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous languages and cultures are not valued in these schools. There's plenty of violence, like a tolerance of bullying, boys will be boys, it's all part of growing up. Corporal punishment, don't even get me started on corporal punishment. So there's lots of this going on in schools. And then finally, there's a lack of flexibility in schooling to accommodate other commitments. There are examples of schools that, for example, have changed their day of schooling. So on market day, they don't hold classes, they hold them on Saturday so that kids can go to market. There are one or two examples, but the vast majority do not make any attempt to accommodate children and households, other working and livelihood commitments. And this is again comes back to that binary where education, formal education, is given priority over any other working and livelihood commitments. And they are supposed to adapt to that. So if we look at the dominant research, there is plenty of research of different kinds that we have drawn on, but we're looking at the dominant discourse and definitions, again, ILO, SDGs, and they're driven by the global north, these conceptions of childhood, work, education and gender that we've been through, producing these in and out of child labour, in and out of work, which produce atomised individuals, snapshots of one moment in time rather than processes going on, and that go on that singular linear stage trajectory implied towards adulthood and economic employment. And these categories, no matter how they're refined, they want categories so that we can count them, we can make comparisons between north and south, between rural and urban, different ethnic groups, and we can rank them, and we can use indicators and proxy indicators. And while some of the indicators are useful, a lot of them, proxy indicators, are not. So if we are saying that someone enrolled in school, which has been in school one day, means they are learning, attainment often means have they gone to the next level the next year. Doesn't mean whether they've learnt anything in between, but if they progress to the next level, it is often used as a proxy indicator for attainment. They don't mean anything. So, but at the same time, they're producing norms against which others are judged. So there's a very strong discourse in the anti-child labour and the SDGs about progress. We are lagging behind, countries are lagging behind, they're not on track, we're on track in this kind of way. And then at the same time, this leads to kind of international rollout of best practice, because we've got these universalised norms, and therefore we've got universalised solutions to these problems. And now I'm handing back to Mairead.
Okay. I don't know what that was. Okay. Just to say that this work that we've done and the literature review that came with it, and those points that Sarah's made about the way that work, childhood and schooling have been brought together in the international literature, made us think of a way that we might conceptualise what's happening with children and in labour and in schooling more holistically. So we are proposing the edgy workscape, which you've got there, and I'll just talk about what it is. What it does actually, more than looking at either one of those apexes of the triangle, what it's doing is saying, let's centre the child. If we centre the child, we can look at how that child navigates in a relational matrix between schools, households and workplaces. And we can put all of that in context. So we understand how those three overlapping arenas of school, work and household interact with the child's life, how the child navigates around those spaces. And of course, the assumption is that learning isn't only happening in school. If it is, it's not only happening in school. Learning, work and harm can happen in all three of those scenarios. And we have to, again, understand that the context is important here, because the context has a really important impact on either three of those particular scenarios and all of them taken together. The context, both locally and within each of those arenas, has different influences on children, and children interact with them in different ways. Of course, we have to also note that the gendering of the child is also important, because it makes a difference to how they engage and are engaged with in each three of those arenas. Again, I want to emphasize that they are overlapping. The analytical process is to separate and divide. But if we're really looking at the child's life, how the child navigates, we need to understand them as overlapping with each other. So we're coming to the end now, and I just want to give a few implications for what this means for research, for the what and how research. In short, it means that we need to move away from an over-reliance on large-scale macro-level studies, using proxies for labour and learning. We need to move away from deficit narratives of countries, communities and parents. We need to move away from universalised definitions of what's going on in different places with different children. And we need to move towards more situated analysis, community level, to look at social geographies of people's lives. We need to have more negotiated, participatory, collaborative and emergent methodologies used to understand what's going on. And we need to move towards local understandings of processes and changing rhythms and disruptions. And we particularly need to look at the local understandings, particularly those of the children. So moving away, as a result of the literature review, we want to move towards these things. I'm just going to finish with a couple of quotes. And this one comes from our good friend Pierre Bourdieu and Lois Bacon. And arguably, the task of social analysis is to produce a precise science of an imprecise, fuzzy, woolly reality. For this, it is better that its concepts be polymorphic, supple and adaptable, rather than defined and calibrated and used rigidly. So that's a quote from Bourdieu and co. And we leave you, of course, with this quote from Abebe and Bessel, which says, children's work concurrently involves interdependent realities of survival, socialization, participation, abuse, and exploitation. Thank you. Do you want to do this bit? Yeah. Okay. As you will see, both Sarah and I have got quite a lot to say, and we've struggled with the constraints of time and space. What we would like to do now, for those people online and people in the room, just to take a couple of minutes to have a short buzz. It may be, if you're online, that you're buzzing with yourself, but just so you can phrase questions and put them in the chat. Gary's going to relay questions in the chat, and we will take questions from the floor, but when you raise the question, you're going to come and speak it to the microphone. So 5 minutes just to have a think, to phrase your question, and then we'll come back to the plenary and discuss your questions. Thanks.
So I have one question already there. James? another one there.
It's not fantastic. Nice ideas. Disabled children who can work patiently to get there, I suppose.
Or I can ask them to.
Okay, so thanks everybody. Lots of buzzing here in the room, and some really interesting questions have been raised online. So why don't we start? Gary, should we start with one of the online ones?
Yep. So this question here is from Sarada Balagobalan. Thanks for this very interesting presentation. How will the edgy workscape, which centers the child, address structural issues and global inequalities? Isn't there a risk of it promoting a culturally realer understanding of these children's lives in which the role of colonial and capitalist exploitation is erased?
Should we take these one at a time?
I think the second one is similar.
Yeah.
Do you want to read
This
that
one's
one?
from Dominic Glover, IDS Fellow. Unfortunately, we live in a world where people of bad faith might take your message and say child labour is not a problem or not the problem. Then instead of focusing on harm, use that pretext as an excuse not to focus on children's well-being and learning. So what language do you describe the approach you are for as opposed to the approach you are against?
Okay.
Nice and easy.
Yeah.
Kick you off.
Start with the easy ones. Shall I go first, Sarah, or do you want to go first?
I don't mind, I can do the first one or not. I mean, it's partly my fault putting the slide together because the wider context that is in the actual edgy workscape is in the paper, but not on the slide. So you can go first about the wider context.
Okay. I think that is a very important question. And I think mostly what we're trying to say is that there is a world of efforts to try to look at child labour, but they only give us a very thin way into looking at what is actually happening. And this is not for one set of approaches to obliterate another, but actually it is really pointing to the need for more contextualized local studies that can feed into how data is collected at a more macro level, if you like. So I think the structural issues are certainly there. I mean, besides the gender issue, ones of global poverty, etc., they will remain there. So this is not to present an either or, it's to say we need to have more of these localized studies to get other people's versions of what is child labour and what isn't, and even to raise them within local communities. Of course, this is much more in-depth and participatory, which in terms of funding research is much more expensive. But I think it might get us nearer to addressing some of the issues that child labour raises for us. And because Sarah and I both actually come through from education, I think our concern was that education was too much of a black box, and we need to understand that it's not the panacea that stops child labour. And there's sometimes an assumption that that is the case, or a suggestion that that is the case. So that I hope that's answered the first one. And to the second one, that does mean we need new vocabularies. We need new words and vocabularies to understand what the situation is of different people around the globe with different children. It's not to say child labour isn't a significant issue. It's actually to say, let's refine the way we understand it and look at it. So I hope that's answered those two. Sarah, you can add if you want to.
No, well, I was just going to add to what Sarada's saying. In the paper, we have been more explicit about the contextualization. So each of these three social arenas is contextualized in multiple ways. So, for example, the households work within communities, work within larger bodies, national countries or ethnic groups or whatever. And also education, we was working within local government, state government, national government, which are working within global unequal systems of education as promoted by the Sustainable Development Goals. And equally, contextually, we're talking about physical, socio-political, which exactly covers the things you've said, the structural issues like global inequalities. So if we're looking at workplaces, we're looking at them within system of increase in agribusinesses within Africa, which happen within global systems of capitalism and economic inequalities. So we are finding a way in, as Mairead said, but we are definitely not wanting to make it culturally relativist and dismissing the ills of colonialism and capitalism and neoliberalism that have produced a lot of the realities on the ground. And thank you for asking that question, because I was going to get going on it and didn't have enough time. Right.
Okay, thank you. Let's take a couple of questions from in the room. If people have questions, anyone have a question they'd like to ask? Don't be shy. Yes, can you please come up to the mic and just let us know who you are and ask the question. You can take your mask off if you like.
Ooh, at last. Thank you. My name is Omwa Robert. I'm a student of International Education and Development. Thank you, Sarah. So first time seeing you, though I've heard much of you, and my professor, Mairead. My question is that looking at the context in which you have given us the talk, it's actually questioning the kind of education that you're having in the global south and in the context in which that education is provided. Would I be right to say that it's time that we also reimagined education? We reimagined how education is provided vis-a-vis the needs of people in the global south. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert. That's a great question. In fact, I'm going to add mine. I told Mairead I had a question for her, and it's very similar to your one, so I thought I'd add it, and we can ask for another couple then. So you ended saying that maybe we should move away from this deficit language, and I was left thinking, well, why would we do that? Because what you have presented to us are tons of deficits in education, quite frankly. Throughout the presentation, it just seems like education in these environments are massively in deficit. So I think similar to what Robert was saying, why would we get away? Why wouldn't we focus on saying, no, we need to make sure things work as well as they possibly can, and then decide what the right level of work for kids should be. Anyway, I'm just putting that there. Any other questions from the room? Yes, can you come up? Thank you.
I'm seeing Toby, MA International Education and Development. Thank you, Sarah, Professor Moret. Now, my question really is, how do we start to find a balance with understanding the needs of the kids in many rural societies? I'll use my country, Nigeria, for example, and to see that many of these societies function as a result of these indigenous practices, and finding that balance with Western education. For a lot of times, there's always a clash. So one big example would be agriculture, for example. Many kinds of fruits and what they call plants in Nigeria continue to go extinct because a lot of people no longer farm them. So, for example, a lot of the fruits I used to eat when I was growing up, I don't even know how they are planted, and that's because a lot of my education was in the center. And so in finding this balance between the curriculum and the indigenous practices, where does this balance come from? And how do we do that as education practitioners?
Thank you. Okay, so shall we take responses?
Yeah, we can. Sarah, do you want to go first, or shall I?
No, you go first. I lost some of that last one. My something went wrong with mine. What have you?
I'm not sure if I'm going to answer these in the right order or what order, but what I think is that we have a big education literature. It doesn't necessarily talk very much about children's other lives. It talks about children who are dropouts, who abscond, or they don't attend, or they don't achieve. It talks about children in ways that produces them in deficit, and also produces their families as if in deficit. Their families don't understand the value of schooling. So there is a strong line in the education literature that would talk in that way. And some work actually that I did in Nigeria and with Sarah actually, and a team of researchers there looked at how when families don't send their children to school, what is going on for them. And it was a complex issue of the social and political context that they were in, as well as that issue that the school sits there proud, even though it is described as a community institution, actually doesn't confer with the community. It sits there proud. It doesn't give any attention to rhythms of the planting season, for example, if we're talking about agricultural places. It just stays doing what education looked like in this country 100 years ago. And there's something about the way that education has been introduced that hasn't produced teachers as it's produced teachers as more as technocrats rather than problem solvers, pedagogical problem solvers, or problem solvers within their own communities about, if these children are required to do this, how can we make education fit with their rhythms and lifestyles? Education just sits there proud. So we've got a big problem in that sense. And to change that is a big deal, because people think if you're not giving them the idea of education and schooling that they've grown to believe should be the way it happens, like in classrooms at a particular time of day, blah, 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 they think they're getting second-rate education. So there's an issue there. So there's an issue about education itself. There's an issue in the disjuncture between what education is offering and what people in different localities might usefully benefit from. And so that mix of what the curriculum is like becomes a central issue for education. But moving to the broader sense, it is that if you like, the way that research and development has happened, it's happened sponsored often by the North. It's happens, you know, getting people into schools, getting, thinking about children labouring or not labouring, hasn't been locally produced as a set of issues. And we need to understand more, besides setting in, you know, you've got to do this, you've got to do that, conditions on aid or whatever. We've got to understand more the contexts. And those contexts includes ones of poverty, of different kinds of households, different family forms, different levels of responsibility. If you're in a migrant family, part of the year, your parents might not even be where you are. So, you know, there's lots of different conditions that produce difficulties. And if we continue to look singularly at education without looking at work opportunities, without looking at the condition of poverty and inequalities, we're not really going to get to some of those ideas. Right, that was a little bit of a rant, so I'm not sure if I answered the questions, but you can come back.
Yeah, do you want to make a comment? Yes, please. Do you want to come up to the mic? Is that all right? So that everyone online can hear it.
Yes, I just wanted to build on Lorraine's point about the deficit narrative, and I think that the recent World Bank report, Learning to Realise Education's Promise, is a really good example of the flaws of that narrative, which talks about a learning crisis and seems to blame everybody, the teachers, the community, the children, without addressing the systems and structures within which they all live and are vulnerable and are caught up in. And one of those key issues is structural adjustment, which has deprived states of funding for education, which was generated by the World Bank itself. So there's a much of a contradiction in the deficit narrative. As Murray said, it tends to blame these communities as unsatisfactory. A highly loaded cultural narrative is implicit in a narrative which seems to be about redemption, the other, but it ultimately colludes with continuation of inequalities without any real critique of the underlying global capitalism, neoliberalism, which is creating them. So I really agree with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you.
Thank you. Can we go, is there a couple more comments online?
One from Matthias here. Hi, thanks for your presentation. In the literature on working children there are many examples of the coming and going of children from work to play. The so-called play work continuum, which is an example of children's collective agency regarding their activities. Could you find examples of that in your research? And how would that fit in approaching the issue of work and learning in future research?
Sarah, do you want to take that, or shall I?
Well, yes, we try to prioritise a lot of ethnographic work, longitudinal work, young lives, several of the studies. You know, we obviously looked at the big ILO and the World Bank literature first, as you have to, as it's the dominant discourse, but then we looked through a lot of studies, and yes, sure, and certainly in the ethnographic work, there's plenty of examples of play happening in various places, just like learning, and perhaps, you know, in our edgy workscape, we need to add play in there. So there's learning, and there's work, and there's harm, and there's play. You know, there are various things that happen right across. So some of the literature that is cited there has examples of that, you know, as kids playing in work and playing in the household as they are learning, you know, simultaneously. Did that answer your question?
It's an online question.
Yeah.
So.
Oh, right. Oh, I see. Like Gary Reed. Sorry.
Yeah. Okay. So any other questions in here? Yes. Can you come up to the mic? Thanks.
Thank you guys for the presentation. This is really hard. I'm on the MA Dev course, and I just had a quick question around if I'm just taking this binary understanding of getting children into education to get around different harm and to improve their chances in life. Is there any link between children going into school and then actually getting work and actually actually getting those opportunities that are apparently out there once they've gone through education. I was just wondering.
Do you mean after school?
After school, yeah. Because the whole idea, I think, is that you put the child into education, and then once they come out of education, they can get a job and so on and so forth. But in some contexts, that's not actually the case. I just wonder how that's being dealt with at the moment.
Thank you.
Sarah, you can do that one.
Well, certainly, in urban areas, if we're talking about wage labour, which is again the key definitional term that people are seeking to earn money, then there's more of availability in urban areas. But there is a huge youth bulge that is coming through Africa, which is going to produce a lot of people. I can't remember the exact stats, but most kids that leave school, and that also includes the urban area, it's a phenomenal amount. Something like 3/4 leave after 6 years of schooling with neither able to write a sentence in any language or add up some numbers. Now, I don't want to privilege literacy and numeracy, because that again is a curriculum issue that's come down from the global north. But what it means is that the vast majority, and certainly in the rural areas, come out of school with nothing. So even if that were the case, they could actually, go and get a job. There aren't then jobs available. So obviously it depends on the place, but broadly, very little is done out of it. But it is the thing about the whole myth and the development myth that is pushing formal schooling as a way out of poverty, and the actual reality on the ground. And you can look, there's plenty of studies done about rates of return and things, and plenty more localized community-based studies that shows, that people, that work isn't there. But you only need one person in the community to go out and get that job, and that keeps the myth alive that, well, maybe. And a lot of the parents in the research that we've been looking at, in the more qualitative research, they're ambivalent. They want schooling just in case somebody does get through and breaks through and gets a good job. But they also want to keep the skills alive to work in the farm or whatever, in case the job doesn't emerge. And, a lot of, parents are making strategic decisions, carers, householders, about the possibilities of labour. And, on the whole, it doesn't, it doesn't pan out. Most people are not going to get a job and get out of poverty. If anything, the system reinforces, because it works against rural kids, because schools are underfunded, and the better trained teachers are not in rural areas because they don't want to go. The jobs are not available afterwards. I could go on and on, but I won't.
Yeah.
So the picture is grim, but I think it's really important to keep this myth keeps going. So part of that is like the language of instruction. There's masses of research being done about the language of teaching and learning in Africa, and masses of evidence to say that kids learn better in their own first, language, or language of the home. And yet governments keep pushing, but equally so do the parents and so do the communities, because they don't want to be sold what they perceive to be second-class schooling. So even though it makes more sense, and there's masses of evidence, lots of research, almost unequivocally it says you're better off learning in your own language first, people are still pushing. So in the slum areas, you'll find there's the low-fee private schools, and their big selling point is we have an English medium school, whether or not it actually happens, because that will attract parents. So there's a whole, this all comes back to, colonialism and histories in Africa that have helped promote schooling as the way out of poverty. And so that goes back to Robert's question earlier, should we be reimagining education, formal education? I would probably think yes, but I'm not the person to answer.
Yeah, can I just add to that? I think there's massive difficulties, because when we're looking at schooling, the ways that universalised notions of school quality are produced actually don't give us a handle on much of what's going on. When you can be called attending school for going once in a year, looking at access rates isn't really going to tell us much, and so added to that, how do you measure quality? It's a really difficult question. And we've got things like the number of teachers, or even the number of qualified teachers. But that doesn't tell us, like the classrooms you saw in the picture, in the photographs, whether the teachers are actually in school, or even how much they're getting paid, or, there's massive problems around it. But we can't get that by just ticking boxes or counting numbers. much as those numbers are important in some ways, we need to get underneath that as well, to give us a more nuanced account of what's happening in different places.
Thank you.
Okay.
Are there any more, Gary, online?
There's one from Dewey here. Do you think traditional assessment system that requires literary skills is one of the reasons behind not considering learnings happening outside the classroom as part of education? For example, a child selling things that can perform complex calculations orally, they basically are running a business, but they couldn't perform simple calculation if asked in written format. So how to decide who is getting education? Should we be looking at or other ways of assessments or not?
Should we take a couple more?
Yeah.
We'll take a couple more questions. So have you've registered that one?
Yeah.
Okay.
Registered it.
Any other questions from the room? Yes. It's very high, sorry.
Thank you for the presentation. My name is Tomoe. I'm in the MA, International Education and Development. And my question is, in the world today, would there be any reconsideration in a very small community level or local NGOs to consider schooling or curriculums to fit for the local needs? Because when I worked in a Peruvian community, it was located in rural area. And actually I encountered a family who didn't send their children to school, but I couldn't say anything to them because they thought they really didn't find any value for sending their children to school because they engaged in agriculture and they were pro-family. So in that occasion, even my Korean colleague couldn't just say please send their children to school, and without any supporting words. Yeah, that was my question.
Okay,
thank you.
Thanks.
Yes. I mean, I might add another one.
Go on then.
Is that all right?
Yeah, of course.
So this work and this paper came out of what they've said, this consortium, this program that looked specifically at children's work, harmful work. And I mean, we've had focused a lot on education here, which is fine. You guys are really on that. That's not, but the work side of things is kind of important. And it's something I've struggled with when we were thinking about this whole program, is that, you've made a strong case, and it's very clear that work and harm and education and school, they don't trade off against each other, like one's good, one's bad. It's obviously much more nuanced than that. And in fact, myself and Jim Sundberg came to this whole thing going, we need to think, what does children's work mean? When is it appropriate? Because I worked as a kid, loads of people. In fact, we interviewed everyone in the consortium, researchers, and everyone's experience as children, they all worked somehow. And some of it was pretty hazardous. But the problem is, I think, in the context that we work in, say, in some of the African countries working where there's high levels of poverty, it's very easy to say, well, I can understand why this kid doesn't go to school. The quality of education is crap. And actually, they're working on the farm. The opportunity cost of going to school is rubbish. In fact, it's not the best situation, but it's better than going to school. So let's go for the second best solution and just live with it. Actually, good for them. But is that something we think is okay to live with, that second best solution? Is it okay to say, oh, it's okay, but yes, it is potentially harmful and hazardous, but it's not as bad as this other situation, sending them to school, which is also potentially harmful and hazardous. And you're taking the best of actually two harmful situations. So that's something we discussed quite a lot, didn't we? And I don't, it's not clear, but it just seems to be like there's a separate type of decision making in our minds going on because there's in a situation of extreme poverty, and then we can go, oh, that's okay, but we wouldn't accept it somewhat in another context. Yes. Do you want to come up to the... Sorry, we've got another comment or question.
Hi, Danielle Rubino. Hi, nice to see you. I'm a PhD in education, working in rural Madagascar with young people. But anyway, what I wanted to ask was about responding to these issues of what you're saying about which one's better, work or school, when neither are that great, is interesting. And I guess I am interested in this question of when schools are harmful spaces and young people find their experience in them harmful in terms of like the microaggressions you talk about. Is there, I've had this conversation with people in Madagascar before who say, you know, we're not there where we can attend to those things because there are so many other issues in schooling, but it seems so fundamental to whether children find school a safe and worthwhile place, whether or not it takes them anywhere. That's a whole other question, or not. So I guess my question is about that. Is it possible to approach those things?
Thank you. Okay, so over to you two. You've got a few minutes.
Okay, I'll start off, Sarah, and you can finish off. I mean, we've got lots of difficult issues here, and part of the issue is that often in development efforts, what goes on, education is used as a coverall, and what goes on in it isn't really looked at in any detail, except for maybe by some education people. And the problem with that is that we don't look at it as a set of social relations. We don't look at it as a space and place where people learn their identities. We don't look at it as replete with power relations, vulnerabilities. We don't look at it like that. And it's just saying, you know, go to school. But what we have to understand is, besides the exams that Dewey was asking about earlier, we have systems of social structures, of social restrictions, of social productions. And schools do this all the time. You know, part of the purpose of school is not so everybody can pass the exam. And indeed, it's so that lots of people don't pass the exam, because we need to have a hierarchy of performance, if you like. And so the very questions you're asking, Rachel, about how do we decide looking at somewhere else? Obviously, we don't want children working. Obviously, we want children learning. But in the context that we're working, and I don't mean necessarily the local community context, I mean the broader context of what comprises school, we have massive problems that we haven't even scratched the surface of. And these are not, as I say, not only about the knowledge that's produced or who performs better, they're about actually regulation of societies, regulation of individuals. And we can't look at schools without understanding all of that goes on inside the classroom. That doesn't make us say, let's not go to school. It doesn't make us say, let's everybody go to work. But, you know, we have to have a much more, well, I would say, sociological view of what happens inside schools and what are the implications of schools for people's lives, because they change over time. We know that. The whole thing of qualification escalation, whereas before you just had to have a post-16 accreditation to do something, now you need a PhD. I'm exaggerating, of course, but you know, that thing of slowly, incrementally increasing what is exchangeable capital, education qualifications, they're capital to be exchanged, usually for money, for position, for status. If we don't understand that that is entrapping the kind of schooling we can offer, we're missing a big trick. We have to understand that that's what goes on. And when we were trying to address children's work, we have to, as we tried to say, address it in context of poverty, where it is a lifeline. We have to address it in context of the school, and we have to address it in terms of people's imaginaries. What are their futures? work I did, Barbara did in Nigeria, talked about youth futures and how they see in gendered terms what schooling gives them and what's their next step, where do they go next? So if we don't understand that schools are doing that, we can't really get to grips with it. We need to have a much more broader understanding besides the building and getting people into that building to stop them working, because it doesn't, we need much more connected, broader understanding of what's going on.
Can I say two quick things? Yeah, I just want to do two quick things. I think also that it's not only just, it's situated within systems of power relations at local, global and international level, and inequalities, you know, these things are situated. This is why reproduction happens, because there are structural inequalities that are built into any institution, including schooling, also including the household. And we've not gone down that route today because we wanted to emphasize other things, but you know, they're there. And to go back to somebody's question, was also a bit about, you know, when it's not very good in school, it's not very good in work, you know, what do we do? I think it's very interesting to note the discourse, the dominant discourse of the SDGs and ILO and World Bank and co, is they're talking about improving the quality of schooling. But there's no suggestion that we pull kids out of school. What I call the worst forms of child schooling, which are going on in some places. Nobody's saying, let's stop that, let's stop that. They're saying, let's improve, you know, the conditions in school. Then, you know, similarly in working places, one might think, well, it's not good conditions for anybody, you know, adults or child, however you define an adult or a child. So, you know, maybe one should be thinking about improving working conditions and economic conditions for anyone on that continuum of child-adult, however it's determined, rather than taking arbitrary numbers saying, well, children under 15, you shouldn't be doing more than 34 hours per week of whatever, you know, whatever the ILO stats are. If you're interested in their description, interestingly, SDG briefing note number 13 gives a whole load of numbers about how particular kinds of work equate with particular amounts of household work and whether you're not in child labour. But, you know, that is the issue, really. You know, totally different discourse about quality in schooling versus quality in work.
Thank you. So I guess this brings us to the end. Just before we cheer you off, I think I need to announce next week's, but I can't remember the title of it. Do you know it, Gary? Yeah, I think we should announce next week's.
It's actually next week.
Is it next week? Yeah, next. Yeah, 18th.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. Okay. All right. So while we wait for that, so thank you so much, Marie. Thank you so much, Sarah. It's been super interesting. Hope we continue to see this carrying on.
Okay.
Okay.
Good. We hope so too.
And let's just cap these guys. Give them a good thank you.
Thank you for coming, everybody.
I think Mairead's going to pop to the bar if anyone would like to join her.
Yeah.
Oh, here's the next. Where's the title? Oh, joining up the climate and SDG agendas. And that's going to be by Joseph Alcamo. Yep. Anyway, so you're very welcome to come next week. But I think you have to register if you want to be in the room. Thank you so much, guys, for joining.
Thanks, Rachel.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks, Sarah.
See you soon.